Picture a chimpanzee. Thick, dark fur from head to foot. A built-in coat dense enough to shrug off rain, sun, and cold nights alike. Now picture yourself. Almost none of that. A few patches on the scalp, the eyebrows, the underarms, and everywhere else a body covered in hair so fine and so pale it might as well not be there at all. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. You have roughly the same number of hair follicles as a chimpanzee. Count them, follicle for follicle, across the same amount of skin, and the numbers land in almost the same range. You are not a bald ape. You are a fully furred ape whose fur simply stopped growing in. Somewhere in the last few million years, something reached into the genetic instructions of our ancestors and quietly switched off the one feature that every other primate on Earth still relies on for survival. Fur regulates temperature. Fur blocks the sun. Fur protects skin from cuts, insect bites, and the elements. Losing it should have been a death sentence for a species walking through the most predator-dense, sun-scorched landscape on the planet. And yet here we are, naked, exposed, and, if you trace the evidence carefully, that nakedness may be one of the single most important adaptations that ever happened to our lineage. Tonight, we're going to dig through fossils, genes, sweat glands, and even the DNA of head lice to answer a question that sounds almost too simple to be a real scientific mystery. Why did humans lose their fur? And exactly like our last investigation, I need to set your expectations honestly from the start. Fur doesn't fossilize. Skin doesn't fossilize. We can't dig up direct proof of when our ancestors' bodies went bare. What we have instead is indirect evidence, genetics, physiology, and clever detective work, pointing towards several competing explanations, some far better supported than others. So let's start with the one clue that almost every scientist in this field treats as the true beginning of the story. Not the fur we lost, but the sweat we gained. Here's the puzzle in its starkest form. Every other primate that shares our environment, baboons, chimpanzees, patas monkeys, all living under the same African sun, kept their fur. Only one branch of the primate family tree went bare. And that branch happens to be the one that also stood upright, grew an enormous brain, and eventually conquered the entire planet. Coincidence seems unlikely. So what changed? What fur actually does? To understand why losing it was such a gamble, you have to understand what fur is actually built to do. It insulates against cold. It reflects and blocks direct solar radiation, keeping the skin underneath several degrees cooler than the air. It's a physical barrier against biting insects, thorns, and minor wounds. Strip an animal of all that protection in a hot, sun-blasted landscape, and by every conventional logic, you'd expect it to overheat, sunburn, and get eaten alive by parasites within a generation. Evolution rarely keeps a dangerous trait around unless it's paying for itself many times over. So whatever caused human hair loss, it had to come with a serious biological upgrade attached. And the leading candidate for that upgrade turns out to be something you've personally experienced every single day of your life, and almost certainly never once thought of as one of evolution's greatest inventions: sweat. Here's where the story gets genuinely exciting, and it starts with a question that has nothing to do with hair at all. How did a slow, weak, clawless ape ever manage to hunt animals that could outrun it in a flat sprint? In the early 2000s, biologists Dennis Bramble and Daniel Lieberman proposed an answer that reshaped how scientists think about early human anatomy entirely. Human bodies, they argued, are not built for speed. They're built for distance. Our long legs, our spring-loaded Achilles tendons, our large gluteal muscles that barely engage while walking but fire hard during running, our unique ability to breathe independently of our stride, all of it points toward one specialized skill: endurance running, sustained for hours in extreme heat. The theory, known as persistence hunting, proposes that early humans in the genus Homo hunted not by outrunning prey, but by outlasting it. Chasing an animal like an antelope for hours under the midday African sun until the animal's own body temperature climbed high enough to force it to collapse from heat stroke, long before the human pursuer did. For that strategy to work, the human hunter needed one critical advantage the antelope didn't have: a cooling system efficient enough to keep running while the prey's own body was shutting down. That cooling system is sweat. And it turns out humans have an almost absurd amount of it. Here's a number worth sitting with. Humans have somewhere between 2 and 4 million sweat glands distributed across nearly our entire body surface. Chimpanzees, by comparison, have a small fraction of that number, concentrated mostly in a few specific areas rather than spread everywhere. Not only do we have far more sweat glands, the type of gland matters too. Most mammals rely primarily on apocrine glands, which produce a thicker, oilier secretion, largely for scent marking rather than cooling. Humans are covered instead in eccrine glands, which produce thin, watery sweat specifically optimized to evaporate quickly and pull heat away from the skin. Evaporative cooling through eccrine sweat is remarkably effective, but only if the sweat can actually reach open air and evaporate rather than getting trapped against the skin. And that's precisely the problem thick fur creates. Fur that keeps rain and sun off your skin also traps moisture against it, turning a would-be cooling system into a soggy, useless blanket. Here's the elegant part. Hair loss and increased sweating almost certainly evolved together, each reinforcing the other. Less fur meant sweat could evaporate more efficiently. More effective sweat meant fur became less necessary for temperature regulation in the first place. Over enough generations, on a hot, open landscape where overheating was a constant threat, that feedback loop could plausibly strip an ape bare. A landscape that demanded it. This story only makes sense against a specific backdrop, and the fossil and climate record actually gives us one. Around 2 million years ago, large parts of East Africa were undergoing a dramatic shift. Dense forest habitat shrinking, open savanna grassland expanding. This is roughly the same window in which Homo erectus appears in the fossil record, a taller, longer-legged, more heat-adapted body plan than earlier hominins like Australopithecus, whose shorter limbs and more forest-adapted anatomy suggest a very different, less sun-exposed lifestyle. An ape moving out of shaded forest canopy and into open, shadeless grassland, walking and eventually running long distances under direct equatorial sun, would face intense selective pressure to solve one problem above almost all others: how not to cook itself alive. Losing fur and gaining sweat glands is, so far, the best supported answer science has for how that problem got solved. But solving the heat problem immediately created a second one, because bare skin under a tropical sun brings its own, very different danger. Fur doesn't just trap heat, it blocks ultraviolet radiation. Strip it away across an equatorial landscape and you expose the skin, and everything underneath it, directly to some of the most intense solar radiation on the planet. Here's where an entirely different piece of evidence enters the investigation: skin pigmentation. Anthropologist Nina Jablonski's research proposes that as hair thinned and skin became exposed, natural selection would have rapidly favored higher levels of eumelanin, the dark pigment that absorbs and scatters UV radiation before it can damage deeper tissue. This isn't simply about preventing sunburn. Excess UV radiation breaks down folate, a nutrient essential for healthy fetal development and cell division. In a landscape offering no fur and no shade for much of the day, unprotected pale skin would have posed a genuine reproductive disadvantage. Genetic studies of the MC1R gene, a key regulator of melanin production, estimate that the dark, highly UV protective skin seen in populations near the equator today had likely evolved by somewhere around 1 to 1.2 million years ago, squarely within the era of Homo erectus, and squarely consistent with a body that had already lost most of its fur. But here's the twist that turns this into a genuinely two-sided evolutionary story rather than a simple one-way adaptation. As human populations later migrated out of Africa into higher latitudes, regions with far less annual sunlight, That same protective dark pigmentation became a liability rather than an advantage. Skin needs UV exposure to synthesize vitamin D, essential for bone health and immune function. In low sunlight environments, heavily UV-blocking skin risks vitamin D deficiency, historically linked to conditions like rickets. Jablonski's research proposes this created renewed selective pressure in northern populations toward lighter skin, allowing enough UV penetration to maintain adequate vitamin D production in a sun-starved climate. In other words, the very same trait, pigmentation, got pulled in opposite directions depending on where on Earth a population's ancestors ended up living. Losing fur didn't just create one evolutionary pressure, it created a chain reaction of them, one adaptation forcing the next across the entire span of human migration. And skin and sweat weren't the only forces at work. Two more theories, far harder to test but impossible to dismiss outright, complicate this picture further. Thick fur isn't just an insulator, it's real estate. Prime habitat for ticks, fleas, lice, and the diseases they carry. Biologists Mark Pagel and Walter Bodmer proposed in the early 2000s that as early hominins began living in fixed camps, sharing sleeping sites, and eventually clustering around fire, dense body fur would have become an increasingly dangerous liability, a breeding ground for parasites capable of spreading disease through an entire social group. Under this hypothesis, individuals with less body hair, and therefore fewer parasites and lower disease risk, would have had a genuine survival and reproductive edge, gradually pulling the whole population toward baldness over many generations. It's a compelling idea, and it isn't remotely far-fetched biologically. But it's also difficult to test directly against the deep past, since parasite loads leave no fossil trace. Most researchers today treat it as a plausible contributing factor rather than the primary driver on its own. Charles Darwin himself proposed a very different explanation. Perhaps hair loss had nothing to do with survival advantage at all, and everything to do with attraction. If smoother skin was, for whatever cultural or biological reason, considered more appealing to potential mates within early human populations, that preference alone could have driven the trait forward. The same evolutionary mechanism responsible for a peacock's tail, which offers no survival benefit whatsoever, only reproductive one. This theory is notoriously difficult to test using fossils or genetics, since mate preference leaves essentially no physical trace at all. Most researchers today view it as plausible in principle, but nearly impossible to confirm or rule out with the evidence currently available. A genuine open question rather than a dead end. Any honest documentary on this topic has to address one more idea you may have already heard: the aquatic ape hypothesis, which proposes early humans went through a semi-aquatic evolutionary phase, with hair loss and subcutaneous fat evolving as adaptations for swimming and diving, similar to whales or hippos. It's a genuinely fascinating idea, and it is also not supported by the fossil, anatomical, or genetic evidence, and is considered fringe by the overwhelming majority of paleoanthropologists. We're naming it here specifically because good science means telling you not just what the leading theories are, but which popular ideas the evidence doesn't actually back up. So, with sweat, sun, parasites, and mate choice all potentially in play, one more question remains, and it might be the most fascinating clue in this entire investigation. Is there an actual gene connecting any of this together? In 2013, geneticist Yana Kambarov and her colleagues published a discovery that reads almost like a plot twist in this story. They were studying a gene called EDAR, specifically a variant of it called EDARV370A, extremely common in East Asian populations, linked to thicker hair shafts and a distinctive tooth shape. But when the team engineered this same human variant into mice, something unexpected showed up alongside the hair changes. The mice also grew significantly more eccrine sweat glands. Read that again. One single genetic variant, in one experiment, visibly affected both hair structure and sweat gland density at the same time. Physical proof at the molecular level that these two traits we've been treating as separate chapters of this story might be genetically linked, controlled by shared or overlapping developmental pathways deep in mammalian biology. To be clear about the science here, this specific EDAR variant is a relatively recent, population-specific change, not the ancient mutation responsible for humanity's overall hair loss millions of years ago. But its discovery matters enormously for a different reason. It demonstrates, concretely, that hair and sweat glands aren't evolutionarily independent traits governed by unrelated genes. They can be shaped by the very same genetic switches, which makes the sweat-driven hair loss story from Chapter 2 look less like a coincidence and considerably more like a documented biological mechanism. Reading the timeline from lice. If genetics can't yet hand us an exact date for when humanity's fur disappeared, there's one more astonishingly clever piece of evidence that gets us remarkably close, and it comes from an unlikely source: lice. Human head lice and human body lice are, genetically, nearly identical, except body lice have evolved specifically to live and lay eggs in clothing fibers rather than directly on skin or hair. That means body lice, as a distinct evolutionary lineage, could not have existed until humans were regularly wearing clothing. In 2003, geneticists Ralph Kittler, Manfred Kaiser, and Mark Stoneking compared the DNA of head lice and body lice and calculated when the two populations genetically diverged, landing on an estimate of roughly 170,000 years ago. Think about what that number actually implies. Clothing only becomes useful once your body has already lost the fur that used to keep you warm. Which means, according to this evidence, humans were almost certainly already substantially hairless well before that date, potentially by hundreds of thousands of years, with clothing arriving afterward as a cultural replacement for the natural insulation evolution had already taken away. It's an elegant, almost accidental piece of detective work, an insect's DNA quietly preserving a clue about human skin that no fossil ever could. By the time Homo sapiens emerges as a species, roughly 230,000 years ago, the fossil and archaeological record shows a species that has fully replaced its biological fur coat with something far more flexible: culture. Evidence for the controlled use of fire stretches back at least 1 million years at sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, with widespread habitual use appearing by around 400,000 years ago. Fire meant warmth on cold nights without needing fur at all, and warmth that could be carried, shared, and controlled in ways no coat of hair ever could. Clothing, as the lice evidence suggests, layered on top of that even further, giving hairless bodies a portable, removable form of insulation that could be adjusted to any climate a population migrated into, from the equator to the edge of the ice sheets. In a strange sense, this is the real answer to tonight's mystery. Humans didn't simply lose protection. We traded a fixed, permanent, one-size-fits-all coat of fur for a modular system built from sweat glands, pigmented skin, fire, and clothing. A system so much more adaptable that it eventually let one nearly hairless African ape walk into literally every climate on Earth, from equatorial rainforest to Arctic tundra. Every one of the theories in this documentary, endurance hunting, thermoregulation, parasite avoidance, sexual selection, skin pigmentation, is still actively debated by the scientists who study this question for a living. Most researchers today believe the true answer isn't any single explanation working alone, but several of these pressures compounding together, reinforcing each other across hundreds of thousands of years, exactly the way hair loss and sweat gland density appear to reinforce each other at the genetic level. Not one dominant cause, a convergence of many. Think about what that actually means the next time you feel a breeze on bare skin, or wipe sweat from your forehead on a hot afternoon. That sensation, mundane, automatic, barely worth noticing, is the direct physical inheritance of one of the most consequential trades our ancestors ever made. They gave up the oldest, simplest form of protection a mammal can have in exchange for a cooling system so effective it let a slow, clawless, fangless ape outlast prey twice as fast as it was on the hottest, most exposed landscape on the planet. We are, quite literally, the descendants of the sweatiest apes who ever lived, and that inheritance may be one of the single biggest reasons our species survived at all. So here's the question I'll leave you with tonight. If losing our fur was such a dangerous gamble, and it paid off this spectacularly, what other seemingly weak traits in the natural world might actually be hidden evolutionary superpowers waiting for someone to ask the right question? Let me know what you think in the comments below.